some people probably rolling in soon, but thanks for coming. I'm super excited to introduce Miguel Ordeñana. Did I say that correctly?
Ordeñana, yeah, that's fine.
Ordeñana, okay. And he joined the Natural, hey guys in the back, can we have a quiet? He joined the Natural History Museum in 2013, and he's a manager in the Community Science Office. And this is the Natural History Museum in LA, just right next to us. And prior to working at the museum, he worked for a bunch of different wildlife, state, and federal agencies doing work. And then at the Natural History Museum, his role involves educational outreach, getting people involved in community science. He works presently on bats as well as local carnivores, and recently set up a jaguar camera trap in Nicaragua, which is now self-sufficient and rolling, which is really cool. And he's focused on inspiring the next generation of a more diverse base of scientists.
Yeah.
So, great.
All right. Thanks everybody for having me. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about my career and basically the steps I took to get here. And definitely from the lens of a person of color, obviously, because that's what I am. I'm a Nicaraguan American, and I had a unique experience getting to where I am today, and it really kind of is a lot different from a lot of my colleagues that I know that are my age and older, younger, and so hopefully it gives you some perspective of some of the barriers out there for people trying to pursue a career in this, but also some of the creativeness and I don't know, yeah, creativeness that is required has to do with the fact that I'm studying wildlife in places where really nobody has studied them before. Even though these species that I study are very close to us at all times for the most part, just people, scientists, educators even have basically overlooked wildlife in the city for quite a while until recently. But it makes the more opportunity for us though. So quickly, I just want to acknowledge a lot of the partners and funding agencies that have supported a lot of the work that I'll be talking about today. But first I want to show you a quick video that really summarizes kind of the work that I do now. And you see there's a black bear in there. I don't know if you caught the coyote. And so this is in Altadena, not too far away. And what you're seeing here is a black bear in someone's backyard. And this is a coyote that is basically chasing this black bear away, all by itself. And I was like, what's going on here? I never thought a coyote would be that bold. I knew they were pretty bold in some cases, but that bold was just amazing to me. And then I slowed down the video, and you can see that it's a lactating female. And so we think that the reason why this coyote was willing to do that, willing to risk her life, was because she likely had pups in a den nearby. And coyotes, bobcats, sometimes have dens in people's backyards. And we got this video because our community science program is so well known at this point locally that people, if they get some really cool footage like this or photos, they send them to us via email, via text message, via social media. But we end up getting this amazing footage. And so what we're doing as an institution now is really great because we're trying to capture all this information from private property. And if LA County is probably 70–75% plus private property, and we're not studying any of it and not including it in biodiversity research, we're missing a huge chunk of the big picture. And so that's the gap that we're trying to fill as an institution. But to give you a little bit of personal background, as far as this, not really going this far back, but just kind of, this is my only picture in Griffith Park. And I grew up right outside of Griffith Park. If you're familiar with that, if you're not familiar with it, it's the place where the Hollywood sign is, the observatory, the LA Zoo. My mom moved us there right outside the park, not because she knew of all the nature that exists there, but because she thought and knew it was a safer neighborhood than where we were living before. And that was that simple. And so we moved there, but because we were against this big wilderness, I would get coyotes roaming through my neighborhood and skunks and things like that, which was really inspiring for me and really got my curiosity going. But nonetheless, I didn't know all the nature that existed in there. I didn't really have the full knowledge that I probably should have had and deserved to have of what was really in this park. All the plants, all the animals, even basic species like bobcats and deer. This is a bobcat from Griffith Park, and I had no idea bobcats lived there until I was in graduate school. And deer the same. My mom, I talked to my mom the other day, you really don't remember anybody telling us that there's deer in this park that we would go to that we lived literally a block away from. And they're like, and my mom was like, no, I had no idea we had deer. We had no idea there's multiple species of squirrels. We thought all the squirrels are the same. So that's kind of our experience. And we use the park for barbecues, quinceañeras, to play ball, and sometimes go on a fun hike more for just to explore and get into trouble versus get some exercise and ID plants or anything like that. We're out there for those reasons. And so we had a missed opportunity as a family there for that reason. The museum, though, was a resource. My mom was a single mother for a while, and she worked full-time and went to school full-time, and she went to school full-time right here. And she would take me across the street after I would basically give her a headache while she was trying to study in the Doheny library. She'd be like, okay, Miguel, we gotta go, take you to the museum, get out your energy. So I'd run through the mammal halls and get inspired by all these dioramas that are still here to this day. And I was inspired about the fact that there's dinosaurs in the world, that there's amazing mammals like African lions and elephants out there in the world. It really fueled my passion for wildlife. But the message was, if I wanted to study these animals, I have to go to Africa, or I have to go to the Amazon, I have to go to Australia. Being a scientist or loving nature is a career for somebody that lives outside of LA. And so that's kind of the message that I got. Then fast forward, I went to USC, studied environmental studies. And close to my senior year of college, I had an opportunity to study abroad in Africa. And previous to that, I really didn't know what I was going to do. I thought I was maybe going to be a zookeeper or a veterinarian maybe. But then I started, after getting a lot of experience doing zookeeping at various places, I thought, how can I study these animals in the wild? There must be a way. There must be a way to figure out how they're surviving in their unique environments. And so I ended up going to Africa by just seeing a random poster. I literally saw a School for Field Studies poster on one of the hallways in this building the other week. And this is the program that I went to. Saw a poster, applied. My mom was freaked out. She cried her eyes out at the airport. But I went off for 3.5 months and didn't know what to expect. And these are my friends that I lived with for 3.5 months. And some of the animals I saw, African elephants, wild dogs. These are the first time they were spotted in Savo West in quite a few, like 20 or 30 years, which is pretty cool to see. This is our view from our huts. This is Mount Kilimanjaro. But the most impactful part was doing field research alongside researchers. And our project was to look at the effects of human presence, human structures on large mammal presence and absence. And we were within an area which was unprotected, in between two protected areas. We were in between Savo West and Amboseli National Park, and we were trying to see how these wide-ranging large mammals were able to kind of use this unprotected area and what barriers they had. And that was my first kind of introduction to human-wildlife conflict. I thought previous to this that studying animals was just studying their biology, their behavior, and just focusing on the species and the animal, and that's how conservation is done. And obviously that's not the case. If people have to live alongside these animals and share space with them, and you're not understanding their needs, their struggles, and why they killed this zebra with a poison arrow, then you're really not going to save these species or these populations. And what was going on in Africa, the Maasai tribe was having a lot of conflict because the animals were eating their crops that they used to feed their families or to make money, and all the prime water lakes and ponds were in these national parks that they had no access to. And so sometimes they killed them because they're attacking their crops, but sometimes they killed them just because there was a statement to the government. And so those are things I learned. Then I graduated from college. I felt very behind, and I was told I was pretty behind by my professors, like, you should have had a lot of experience by this point. And so I started doing internships. I started working really hard with whatever agency would give me an opportunity, and the first was the U.S. Geological Survey. I studied the impacts of tank training range expansion on the populations of desert tortoises. It's our state reptile, and this was my opportunity to really kind of get experience, but also show people that I'm capable of doing this work. And I share this because some of you, this might be your next step, is an internship. And one key that I would say for your first internship is to work hard, show people that you're capable, that you can work independently, that you can learn fast, or at least pretend like you can learn fast. And it was really great. And they ended up hiring me on full time when my internship was over, which was great. And they kept me on, and then I wanted to move on and study other things. And so I ended up getting experience studying raptors like spotted owls and goshawks in the Sierra Nevadas. And then also studying the impacts of ground squirrels on levee systems. This was after Katrina. I'm dating myself a little bit here. And so right after Katrina, there was a lot of pressure on levee managers to basically cut all the trees out, like get all the riparian habitat out of there, because they felt that it attracted ground squirrels or beavers or nutria, depending on where you lived in the country. And we knew as biologists that that wasn't the case. Ground squirrels specifically loved open habitat, loved open grass without trees. So if we were to cut all those trees out, there'd be even more ground squirrels in that habitat, making Swiss cheese out of those levee systems. And so that's what our study was about. And we told FEMA our results, and now the state started filed a lawsuit against them, which is great. And then I started focusing more on what my true passion was urban carnivores. I was able to learn a little bit about them in in undergrad, that they existed out in Southern California, that we had bobcats in Southern California. And through the Desert Tortoise Project, a researcher was studying urban bobcats, and I was like, urban bobcats in Orange County in Irvine? And they're like, yeah, they live out there, they're surviving. And this is a camera trap photo. And this is just when camera traps are becoming big. And camera traps are motion activated cameras that take pictures of animals and provide a date and a timestamp and a really clear image, hopefully, of that animal, so that you can use it as evidence that that animal was there at that given time and location. And you can put these cameras in placements where you have some within the urban environment and just on the edge of the urban environment, to see how these species are using both of those types of spaces in close proximity to each other. And what we're learning pretty quickly is that the more urban, the more human activity there was in front of these cameras, the later these predators would come out, which really affects them, because that means that they have less time to hunt, find mates, find the resources that they need. And so that was something that was interesting. But previous to camera traps, to study nocturnal animals like this is very difficult. You have to rely on tracks and scat And whatever basically was left behind, that's a coyote scat. It's very tapered at the end there. Bobcat scat is a little bit more of a Tootsie Roll shape, has a sheen to it. Ball and socket kind of connections there. Yeah, it's very technical when you do scatology. We also would collar these animals to track them remotely using radio telemetry or GPS devices, and to see how they were using this landscape, which is really fun. So yeah, I already talked about what camera traps are, and to give you kind of a sense of why study these animals and why they're such great indicators of urban ecosystem health is this great diagram here. And so let's say both of those circles are both Griffith Park, the same park, but each of those polygons represent two different species. So A and B represent two different species. So A, let's say, are the home range size, each polygon is the home range size for a mountain lion, and B, all those polygons are home range sizes for raccoons. And also that border, you see there, the circle, the boundary is the reserve border, or Griffith Park's boundary. And so, as you can see really clearly, that more raccoons can be supported in Griffith Park than mountain lions. Is that pretty clear? Yeah? But also what's important is that what this circle means to a raccoon versus a mountain lion. So let's say that is the border. Once you get out of the perimeter, park perimeter, you're into someone's backyard. You're into a freeway, or you're into a busy street. So for raccoon, they can take advantage of that backyard, even that alleyway. They can live under a dumpster their entire lives, have babies successfully, eat everything in that dumpster that spills out of that dumpster successfully. If you're a mountain lion, you need deer in that habitat. If there's no deer, you're in a bad situation. And if there's no other native prey, then you're also in big trouble. If you get into someone's backyard looking for deer and you get spotted, they're going to respond differently to you than they are to a raccoon. Does that make sense? And so this boundary going beyond the reserve border means something differently to a mountain lion than to a raccoon. And so when I say urban carnivores, they're not all under one specific bubble or one category. It depends if you're on your size, your dietary breadth, and your behavioral plasticity. So your ability to adapt to your environment. And also whether or not you're solitary versus a social carnivore. All of those come into play and really impact whether or not you're going to be able to adapt to the city or not. And so that was what my master's research was on. And looking at different carnivore species that live in Southern California, using over 200 camera traps distributed across 5 counties of Southern California to see how gray foxes and mountain lions respond to the urban environment compared to a coyote or a raccoon. And what we were finding is the probability of occurrence for a mountain lion increased as you got further away from the urban edge. If you're a raccoon, your probability of occurrence decreased as you got further away from the urban edge. If you're a raccoon, there have been studies on raccoons specifically that they occur at higher densities within neighborhoods right on the edges of these beautiful, expansive urban parks than there are raccoons within those parks, because in these neighborhoods, they don't have any competitors. They don't have any other predators. They can find all the food that they need on a regular basis. Again, back to the dumpster scenario. But if they had to live in that park, they had to hunt for food, go foraging for food, and try and find it, find regular sources of food, which is more difficult. They have competitors and predators out in that environment that they wouldn't have in the city. So those are all things that come into play. But also to let you know that why we have so many predators out here and biodiversity in general, it's important to note that we're within the California Floristic Province, which is one of 35 biodiversity hotspots that exist in the world. That's a term that was created by Conservation International to not just say, hey, that's awesome, you have a lot of species that live in your area and nowhere else, but it's also a call to action. Because to be a biodiversity hotspot, it means that you've lost 70% of the species that used to call your area home. And all those species are endemic species, which means that they're species that live there and nowhere else. So to be a biodiversity hotspot is kind of cool, but it also means that you're in trouble, and mostly due to habitat loss. Also, another criteria that makes Southern California and LA special is the diversity of habitat that exists here. I'm sure you've heard the term, even if you're not even from LA, that you can go skiing in the morning and go to the beach in the afternoon. And there's not a lot of other places out there that you can say that. So that just speaks to that we have high elevation areas, we have coastal areas, we're on the edges of desert, coastal sage scrub, we have a lot wetland areas, we have a lot of different habitat out here. But when you think about it, and people are still thinking, okay, yeah, nature is pretty prevalent here in LA, but it's within these patches of green space, like Griffith Park. So right here, you're looking at the edge of Griffith Park here. But people then would think that, okay, nature basically ends there, but as we go towards downtown, nature basically becomes non-existent. And so that's kind of been the mindset, or the nature that is there are pigeons and cockroaches, and we don't need to study that. We know they're there, who cares? And here's an example of that. Basically, yeah, that's not true. This is at the Natural History Museum. These are raccoons hanging out in our pond. So yeah, nature is definitely everywhere, but we have to acknowledge that there are certain species like the western gray squirrel that are not as adaptable as raccoons and as other species. And they do need those contiguous open spaces that still remain here in Los Angeles. Bobcats also, they have this kind of intermediate level of adaptability to the city, in between like a mountain lion and a coyote, because they are small enough to be able to take advantage of small prey like rabbits and rats in someone's backyard, but they only eat meat as obligate carnivores. As strict carnivores, they can't take advantage of everything in a dumpster or all that cat food or dog food that people leave out, or ornamental fruit that a coyote can take advantage of. And also they're solitary. They're not willing to be in packs and work socially, and they're not willing to adapt to people's presence like a coyote would. So for all those reasons, they have these varying abilities to adapt to the city. But also we brought water to places where water wasn't present before, and that has also provided opportunities to different species. And also we have imported a lot of species on purpose or on accident. And this is really summarized well in our Nature Lab exhibit at the Natural History Museum. We're a transportation hub. We have LAX, we have the Port of LA, all these different means for species of different kinds to enter the the Los Angeles area through the agriculture industry, through the pet trade, and just basically thrive here because of our wonderful Mediterranean climate that's very mild and accommodating to a lot of species regardless of where those species originally came from. And if you're an invasive non-native species that is very bold, aggressive, bigger than the native counterpart, then you're going to really take advantage of that situation and possibly push this other species into local extirpation. So those are all, again, characterized well. That story is really told well in our Nature Lab at the Natural History Museum. We have opossums at the Natural History Museum is another category, kind of fills the same niche as a predator, a local small predator, but it is a marsupial. It's not native. It's native to North America, but not native to LA, but eats bird eggs, lizards, fruits. It's an omnivorous predator, but it is nocturnal as well. Here he is, or she is, I remember I saw the back end of this guy in the nature gardens taking a nap right across the street. But yeah, so yeah, these animals are very charismatic. They have potential impacts to our daily life and economy, and this is talking broadly about urban mammals, including bats. that I'll talk about in a second. And they also shed light on obstacles that other species may have with regards to human-wildlife coexistence. And so they're really great at getting attention for urban wildlife as a whole, which is great. And I'll talk about a few projects listed here. Try and go a little bit faster here, but before I get into pumas, I really wanted to allow you to kind of reflect on this photo, because this really is important to really showcase the adaptability of this species. LA was originally home to 5 cat species, big cat species. We had the American lion, we had the giant jaguar, we had the scimitar cat, we had the saber-toothed cat, and number 5, can someone say number 5? Mountain lion, thank you. So he was here during the Ice Age when we had Columbian mammoths roaming through LA, we had saber-toothed cats roaming through LA, there was the puma as well. And it's a very adaptable species in general, which is probably the key to its success, and its ability to eat smaller prey that did not go extinct during the Ice Age extinction. But even after that, it's able to live in wetland environments, mountainous environments, coastal environments, deserts included. And so for those reasons, it's really adaptable for a bigger cat. But its kryptonite are roads. So the red you see here is the impact of roads on Southern California, and this is outdated, so the impact is even greater now. And as you can see, those little white spots are islands of habitat that remain within those roads, within those islands, basically. And for pumas, that has basically nearly pushed them to extinction. Within 50 years, it's estimated that they will go extinct from LA, the LA area, and that's because of their uniquely difficult situation here. So, like I said, the bigger you are, the more narrow your dietary breadth is, and if you're solitary on top of that, the less adaptable you are to the city. Mountain lions are basically the most extreme example of that. Yes, black bears are bigger than them, but black bears also eat everything you can imagine. Mountain lions only eat meat, just like bobcats, but because they're so big, they need deer. So deer also need a lot of space, and so deer need that contiguous habitat, and so do mountain lions. Also, mountain lions are solitary, and territorial, so they don't like being around each other. So basically they occur at very low densities because of that. And so a couple mountain lions dying is a huge hit to the population. And at the rate that they're dying here, because they're killing each other over space, quite literally, or they're getting hit by cars trying to escape one another, or they're inbreeding, pushing basically their genetic pool down the drain, and then also, they're getting killed by rat poison exposure on top of all that. So for all those reasons, they're really having a tough time. And as you can see here, all these polygons represent different individuals. They're bounded by the ocean on the south, and on the north, it's the 101 freeway, which is a huge barrier for them. And it's become a soap opera because they're killing each other over space, they're inbreeding with each other, they're killing their own mates. P1's a great example. P1 is the very first puma ever studied. That's what P1 stands for. He killed his own mates after mating with them. He killed his own offspring. He killed other male competitors. And so he has this heightened level of territoriality that's indicative of this population, which is not natural and not sustainable. And again, 23 out of our 24 pumas that have been tested have tested positive for poison exposure. 20 recorded puma deaths due to vehicular collisions since 2002, which is when they start being studied. And so I took all this information, was inspired by it, and when I had the opportunity to move back to LA, I was on a mission to study wildlife in Griffith Park because I knew that this is a potential wildlife oasis that was being overlooked by both scientists and park managers. And so when I had the opportunity to move back, I teamed up with a couple of scientists And we started a camera trap survey because that was my area of expertise, studying carnivores and connectivity. And so we put cameras out and to see basically if Griffith Park, which you see there as the eastern end of the Santa Monica Mountains, how connected is it to the western Santa Monica Mountains? And so we put cameras on potential corridors and also in the interior of the park. So those are the camera traps again. And so when I say corridors, though, it's not these beautiful greenways that make it easy to cross. It's whatever is left over and easier than crossing a freeway. And so this is a bridge, an overpass that goes over the 101 freeway. And here is a underpass that goes under the 5, and also there's a similar one that goes under the 134 freeway, made for equestrians to cross. And they cross all through the night, so makes it hard for these animals to have an opportunity. But nonetheless, they were crossing, which is great news. That Griffith Park was not an island. That was basically our question. This family of deer are crossing out of Griffith Park towards the Hollywood Bowl. This bobcat's going under one of those tunnels. And here is a deer kind of showing you how intense it can get sometimes. So here's a car coming straight on to this buck right on that same bridge, but fortunately the buck survived. And then we got the ultimate proof of habitat connectivity by this huge surprise. And as I said, I grew up right outside the park, so finding this in my local park that I grew up going to was like seeing Chupacabra or Bigfoot for the first time, because it was always kind of an urban legend, literally, that a mountain lion lived in LA and in Griffith Park, but it was nobody was able to ever prove it. And when people tried to prove it, they were sending in cat photos or Chihuahua photos or bobcat photos. And so seeing this was pretty amazing. But this was actually the first photo I saw. And I thought I was honestly seeing stuff because I was used to looking at rabbit after dog being walked, and then seeing this massive puma butt was just like, I thought it was maybe a Great Dane right up against my camera or something, and of course it wasn't. We knew it was a male mountain lion because there's a little black dot under the tail there. Only males have that from scent marking residue, but we didn't know where it came from. We didn't know if it came from the Verdugos to the north, or the western Santa Monicas, and some scientists, I won't say any names, actually thought it was an escaped exotic pet from a Hollywood mansion on the edge of the park. But it was captured. I found a great place for the Park Service to capture the puma, and they captured him to take some measurements, learn more about him, put a GPS tracking device on him, and most importantly, takes a blood sample to get some genetics to see if he was related to any other pumas that they were studying before. And they would give this puma the name P22 for Puma 22. And the genetics came back, and his dad was that monster P1. P1 was his dad, and his dad was very well studied, and his dad's territory ended at the 405 freeway, and basically took up the entire Santa Monica Mountains because he killed everybody, or all the mountain lions in his territory. So he had a territory of 200 square miles that went up against the 405. So that meant that P22 had two choices once he reached adult age, which was to fight his dad or to try and escape. And he tried the latter option, which was a really risky option as well, because now actually 3 mountain lions have died trying to cross east of the 405. And so he made it across that, went through Beverly Hills, Bel Air, Franklin Canyon, Studio City, and then very close to Hollywood, he crossed the 101 freeway, another major 8 to 10 lane freeway. So that was the last barrier he crossed to get into Griffith Park, and I got the first photo where you see that big cross right on that same ridge just a few meters away, right above the Ford Amphitheater, if you've ever been there. And then it became a really cool local story initially. People were like, wow, there's a mountain lion actually in Griffith Park, and everybody knows Griffith Park here locally for the most part. And then this photo was taken by National Geographic after about 14 months of trying, And they got this beautiful photo that sends a huge message, right? Because you can never imagine, especially growing up here, that there would ever be a mountain lion being photographed underneath the Hollywood sign. And Hollywood, that sign is definitely a symbol of LA that people know from all over the world. And this says a couple things. So for me, it says that nature is more resilient than we thought. Also that LA is not just a place for movie stars, smog, and traffic. It's also a really cool place where there's a lot of cool species that exist right under our noses. But it's also a call to action. This is not the ideal situation for a mountain lion. This park is big, one of the biggest city parks in the country, but it's only 9 square miles. Like I said, his dad had 200 square miles to himself. And so for this mountain lion to be able to persist in this area is great, but it's not ideal. So anyway, that was the main message. And the other thing is, this basically is a call to action, hopefully, that we have an opportunity to go one of two directions. Our mountain lions population is a good example of, we're in this really important point right now where we need to decide whether we want to have mountain lions for future generations, or we're going to let them kind of become locally extirpated. Because if we want them here, we have to improve connectivity across our local open spaces. So fortunately, people are really rallying behind this movement. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how these animals are surviving, or how we're learning that they're surviving in such an urban landscape, unprecedented situation. So here he is, P22, right in front of my cameras. Less than 30 seconds later, there's a hiker. And there's thousands of people that come through the park every single day, tourists, locals. There's homeless people that live in the park. There's night hikers. There's a curfew of 10 p.m. in the park. So he has a lot of opportunity to take advantage of those human resources. But he doesn't. Knock on wood, he's keeping to himself. He's eating the same things every other mountain lion's eating, deer. But yes, he does occasionally have to go crisscross through people's yards. And that is just part of his life, his unique life. And sometimes it means that he has to escape people. And here he is jumping an 8-foot fence. Wow. After he got spooked by somebody's car lights. But the majority of his efforts are to get to these canyons where he would likely find deer and ambush a deer to kill it, and also to patrol the boundary of his territory. That's basically what he does every single night. And these points really show off that he uses all of the park, not just the remote parts of the park, but he uses all of the park basically to look for deer. Or at least go to somewhere that likely has deer. And so there he is eating one. But he also eats raccoons. So 87% of his diet is deer, but 13% are raccoons and coyotes. And that, unfortunately, that aspect of his diet got him into trouble, because raccoons and coyotes are common predators in people's backyards, and people put rat poison out in their backyards. And people, even the park park officials put poison in the park to control for rodents. And so homeowners are usually doing it to kill that squirrel that's eating their tomato plant. And then the coyote or the raccoon eats that rodent, or eats a lot of those rodents. They don't die right away. Then they become sluggish, easy prey for a mountain lion. The mountain lion eats a lot of these coyotes or raccoons that are easy to catch. They accumulate that toxin in their bodies. They die outright from the poison through internal bleeding, basically, or they work their butt off to fight off that, but then they can't fight off any other naturally occurring disease, which includes mange. And so P22 almost died from mange exposure because he was also fighting off 3 or 4 different types of rat poison at the time. So that's unfortunate. So yeah, I just kind of want to really use this map to show you this is a situation. That blue polygon is his dad's territory, and that green is obviously his. So to give you an idea of how unique his situation is, then he, despite his efforts to avoid us, sometimes he takes a cat nap under somebody's house, and then In this case, a security team was trying to install security cameras for a big house in the Los Feliz neighborhood, and they came across P-22, and then the local wildlife officials and unfortunately the media came out, surrounded the house. They shot him with beanbag rounds and tennis ball guns, trying to get him to leave even though they surrounded the house. So I don't know what they wanted to happen there. They had helicopters going around all night. Finally, the media tired themselves out and they shut the lights off and he left and nobody saw him leave even though they had cameras all around the house. So he's definitely a ghost cat. Something also which I take a lot of pride in is that we're one of only 2 megacities in the world that can say that they have a big cat living within their city limits. The other is Mumbai, and they have leopards. So hopefully this and the fact that it's important to conserve wildlife. They've been here since the Ice Age. They deserve to be here. Hopefully all those things inspire people to keep them around. And so here's a wildlife crossing that is basically being fundraised for and has been an idea for many, many years, but has never gotten legs until the P-22 story kind of made its way into the media and into the public consciousness. And so they're up to $13 million fundraising for this bridge. Unfortunately, it's going to take about $80 million to build this thing because the biggest of its kind will cross more lanes of traffic than any other wildlife crossing. But as I said, this is what has to be done. And hopefully the wealthy people out here that claim they're really green, movie stars, etc., hopefully they put their money where their mouth is finally. So he's also been an inspiration. We have a P-22 exhibit at the Natural History Museum where it's very interactive, but it also tells this story. And as a kid that went to this museum and had this different message from everything in there, and now having this message sent to youth that was my age at the time is huge. That we're definitely placing more emphasis and priority on local wildlife and using really engaging stories like the P-22 story to really get kids from a very young age to take pride in their local wildlife and not to aspire to go to Africa, which is great. I've been there, it's awesome, but that it's worthwhile to study wildlife and conserve species right here in our own backyard. And here's a group from Highland Park that made their own little P-22 cutout. The story's not over. There's a mountain lion that crossed east of the 405 about 5 years ago, and he's trying to struggle to survive. He actually chased another male back across the 405, and that mountain lion got killed on the 405. So this is a ferocious male that's just may any day cross the 101 into Griffith P-22's territory. So here he is chasing a deer through a Bel Air backyard. Here he comes. So like here he is in the middle of this 405-101 gap. He has one more barrier to go, and then he might have to duke it out with P-22. So we'll see what happens. The P-22 story has inspired me as a scientist. If I could find a mountain lion in Griffith Park, what else is in these smaller patches of habitat? We found bobcat in Highland Park, in Debs Park. We looked in Baldwin Hills for wildlife, found gray foxes, coyotes and other species in patches of habitat that they were thought to be gone from, and also understanding the dynamics of the ecosystems in these smaller open spaces. Like in the Baldwin Hills, here's a cat killing a bird. And why I bring that up is because we also were able to record that coyotes were not as high in numbers as we anticipated them to be. And there is an interaction between coyotes and cats in our LA area. And coyotes either kill them outright because they hate cats as competitors. Also in the more urban environments, they rely on them as food. And that's been studied by our National Park Service. And I helped as a volunteer on this project collecting scat in South Central parks of coyotes, South LA wetlands, Augustus Hawkins, a few miles south of here. And we're finding that their diet in a place like LA is different from a suburb like Thousand Oaks. Their diet is seasonal in Thousand Oaks because they have the opportunity to have more native prey out there and rely on non-native and domestic cats when it's the dry season, when there's less native prey available. In the city, they'll eat more birds and more domestic cats year-round, period. in addition to other anthropogenic foods. And this is information that's crucial to collect because the media can just go run wild with what they think coyotes are eating. They can say they're eating toddlers every month and we'll say, oh yeah, really? We hate coyotes and kill them all, get rid of them all. So these questions and these projects are really crucial. And also having the community involved in these projects is even more impactful. So here's that relationship I was telling you about. Coyotes are in the system, they're controlling cat numbers, at least suppressing them a bit, so that their impact is not as heavy on the native songbirds, etc. If those coyotes are removed from the ecosystem or at lower numbers, these cats have a release in their population and have a really devastating effect on lizards, birds, etc. And gray foxes, I mentioned earlier, are one of only 2 tree climbing dog species in the world. And that's usually probably their reason for success and survival here in LA, because coyotes are direct competitors with them, and so their ability to climb trees is probably saving them from local extirpation in certain parks. And they're also using backyards because they're so small. Here's a Ring doorbell camera capturing one. But sadly, for a lot of these parks, I'm afraid every time I might be too late. That there used to be bobcats there, but the last one I find was that roadkill bobcat. And that was, I thought, the case for Elysian Park, because we thought we had sightings of gray foxes there, but we never thought bobcats could make it there. But then one of my coworkers was on her way to work to the museum and saw a dead bobcat right outside Elysian Park. And then I put cameras in there, and fortunately we found some more. But you never know. It might be too late before we start looking, and that's not where we want to be. Bats have less barriers than terrestrial mammals because they can fly. And so I thought this was a great opportunity to study another understudied species, but also study an animal that can really connect with a wider audience. I can talk about P22 till I'm blue in the face to certain communities, but if they've never been to Griffith Park and haven't been to an open space, period, there's so much I can connect with that person or that family. But by saying that, I found a bat on top of your school's, excuse me, your child's roof. Jesus. I detected a bat on top of your kid's school's roof. That's more impactful. Or I found evidence of bats in your yard within Southgate or within Watts or within Compton. Then that's more of a personal connection that I'm able to provide. And so if you don't know about bats, they're really great. Across the world, they have various benefits. Places where they eat fruit, they're great seed dispersers and more willing to reforest deforested habitat, more so than birds, because they're more willing to go over cleared spaces versus birds will stay at their perch and poop there. Bats will continue to fly over these even clear-cut areas and distribute all these seeds, which is great. Also, they're great pollinators, where we have populations of bats that are nectar feeders. And the closest population is in Orange County. We have the Mexican longnose bat there. But here in LA, we have insect eaters and insect eaters only. And so they have their own benefit, especially if they're in rural habitats. They're helping control crop pests. That saves billions and billions of dollars for the agriculture industry, because those farmers don't have to pay for pesticide, and they're just getting free natural pest control on their crops. And then also, they're eating mosquitoes and multiple species of mosquitoes. And so they're helping kind of prevent the spread of disease if some of these mosquitoes are carriers of disease. And they eat a lot in a single night. They're basically their weight in insects a night. So problems: habitat loss, pesticide use, wind turbines, 1 young per year. So a lot of people think they're rats with wings, they're mice with wings. They have the same life history or natural history of a rodent or a rabbit that reproduces often and has a lot of babies, but doesn't really take care of those babies, and a few survive. but that people think that's its strategy, and they don't live very long. A lot of people don't think. That's all not true. So bats can live between 20 to 30 years. They usually have one young per year, makes them sensitive to local extinction. And so those are really kind of indicative of larger mammal species, which is pretty interesting. But it makes them, just fascinating species. Some ways we're trying to figure out how to save them is by doing more research, stopping pesticide use, building bat boxes, advocating for small urban spaces, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's so important, and also to protect suitable habitat that we know are good for bats. So like dead trees, palms, especially old palms with a lot of fronds. And people just kind of write those off, and that's prime bat habitat, bat roosting habitat. So echolocation is how we study them. They use ultrasonic sound to communicate, to navigate, and they do it in a way where it bounces off an object, whether it's a tree or whatever, bounces back to them in pitch black darkness. They can create a mental picture of what that is based on the sound. If, for instance, they send out a search call, which is a slower frequency call, and they hit a moth, they'll send out higher frequency calls to get a more defined picture of what's in front of them. And also, by sound alone, if they send out high frequency calls, they can see how big that moth is, how fast it's flying, and what direction it's going, all in pitch black darkness with sound, which is pretty amazing. But previous to the work that we're doing now, which is backyard bat research, all the research was basically done in our local open spaces, which makes sense. People put all their resources into studying what bats live in the San Gabriels, what bats live in the Santa Monica Mountains, what bats live in Kenneth Hahn State Recreation Area. And that's good. It gives you kind of a rough baseline of what's out here. But again, if most of LA County is private, you're missing a lot, especially with species that can fly. And these are the species that have been found, 19 species in LA County, and 20 species if you also include Catalina Island, which is also LA County technically. And so I was inspired again by P22 and all these other discoveries, so I started studying Griffith Park as a place for bats. And so I partnered with the LA Zoo. They let me put a bat detector there to record their species-specific calls. And then I got a bunch of success there. I detected a Western Mastiff bat, which is the biggest bat in North America, and was thought to be extirpated from LA for 10 years before we detected it at the LA Zoo. And so getting that bat was really inspiring. And then when I started working at the museum, I put one in our nature gardens, which was just establishing at that time. And we got 2 species immediately. After a lot of people were like, I don't think it's worth paying for that equipment and putting it in our nature gardens. But I was glad we got 2 off the bat, and we're up to 6 species now in our nature gardens, which is pretty amazing. And that includes species of special concern to the state of California, not just these really urban adapted species. So it really speaks to the fact that even in a small open space like our nature gardens, that's only 3.5 acres, that's really important habitat for species that are reliant even on only being able to roost in trees. So we have one of the species we found in the nature gardens only roosts in trees. Even though we only have a little bit of green space there, that bat species has been using that garden regularly for a few years. So that's really important to note, that everybody can have an impact. And studying the LA River was also very inspiring, seeing it as not just a corridor, but also as habitat for other species. Here's a coyote going through one of the islands. Here's raccoons going through the islands. To study bats there, though, was really tricky because I had a lot of equipment stolen, camera equipment stolen, so putting expensive bat microphones was a little bit more risky, and so I put it under the Sunnyside Bridge, which meant that I had to rappel off the bridge every single month, which was scary for me. But it paid off. We got 5 species on the LA River. Most species were species that we expected to find because they were strongly associated with riparian habitat. like the Myotis species. Mexican free-tailed bats are the most common species in LA. Every single place I've looked, we've found these bats. And here's LA River Myotis, which is really cool, California Myotis. But then there's only so far we can get with these projects, me putting a bat detector in this park or that park. You gotta rely on the community at some point, especially if you wanna start going into habitat like that. That's all private. And so community science, if you're not familiar with that term, it's where scientists partner with the public or the volunteers to answer real-world questions that hopefully, ideally, are really relevant to those community members as well, not just to us as scientists. And so it gives us access, like I already mentioned, but also allows us to increase the scale of our research. If it was just me and an assistant, I could only go so far with my research geographically. And so we've used apps like the iNaturalist app. We have a few projects that are focused on squirrels or reptiles, amphibians, or snails and slugs that ask people to photograph local wildlife that they see in their neighborhoods or on hikes. So we can use that data, which is geotagged, to get a better idea of what their distribution here is, especially around private property. The Squirrel Survey is a project that I run, and it's looking deeply into the turf war that's going on between our fox squirrels, a non-native species, and our western gray squirrel, which is our only native tree squirrel species that's limited only basically to Griffith Park now in the middle of LA. And this is kind of why the non-native species is kind of thriving. It's bold, it's habitat generalist, it reproduces twice a year versus the other species that reproduces once a year, and it eats about anything. You saw it eating pizza in that other slide. This species only likes natural food like acorns, nuts, mycorrhizal fungi. It needs tree canopy connectivity, doesn't like crossing roads, and so this is how the eastern fox squirrel got into LA. It was brought over by Civil War veterans that were brought over to West Sawtell Veterans Home in West LA. And they brought them over as pets or as comfort food. We're not sure which, but the hospital staff were like, you got to get rid of those squirrels. This is a misappropriation of government funds if you're feeding them government's table scraps. And so they released them. They thought they were really cute and charismatic, but then they realized that they were wreaking havoc on our orchard industry, which was pretty big at the time. But by the point they realized it was a pest, it was too late. And they were spreading all over the place. There were multiple introductions after that into golf courses. And we're learning that the fox squirrel, which as you see here, is doing well in the urban area. All those points you see there are really deep within the urban core of LA. Whereas the western gray is basically isolated to the San Gabriel Mountains, the western Santa Monica Mountains, and after our Woolsey fire, that might have changed as well, because a lot of the prime habitat that the western gray squirrels were using as strongholds are now gone, or at least still recovering. And so we just found our first detection of a gray squirrel east of the 405 freeway. In the same area where that mountain lion is. And so that's a first for us, which is really great, but we don't know what that means. Does it mean that the western Santa Monica Mountains are just too inhospitable for these squirrels now? What does it mean? But if you want to help us out in a fun way, we have the City Nature Challenge coming up in late April. And our first competition a few years ago was against San Francisco and San Francisco only. It was a great rivalry competition. We beat them that first year, but every year since they've beat us, which is unfortunate. But we've won in categories like having the most participants, which is great. And now it's worldwide. So I don't know how many countries are involved, but over 100 countries are involved now. And they all take it very seriously, but it's a great way to expose people to nature that wouldn't go looking if it wasn't a competition. So it's just a really great way to make this work more accessible for people. But the other way we're doing community science is actually putting research equipment in people's backyards. A good example is our Bioscan project, which is probably the most successful example of that. where they put insect traps, flying insect traps in people's backyards from USC all the way to Griffith Park the first year. And Dean is here, representative of that first year, first iteration of the study. And to date, they found 99 species in LA, 43 new species records. And let that sink in for a second. Those are species that were never described anywhere else in the world till they were collected in a random backyard in LA. And 13 publications have resulted from that, which is awesome. And there's also species that were thought to only live in Europe, for instance, or Africa, and have been found in LA. So I kind of used that similar model and thought, hey, if they can do this with insects, we can find bats in people's yards. They also fly. And we can also study them using similar equipment or remote sensing equipment. And so we use these microphones that I already mentioned, teamed up with a bunch of colleagues in the Urban Nature Research Center that helped me strategize how to do outreach in urban communities, but also scientists that helped me design the project a little bit better. And we put these detectors in the backyards, and then we expand that to schools. And it was a really great project because still is because the scientists are getting a lot out of it because we didn't know anything about bats here locally, especially in private property. And the public is connecting with species that are controversial to some people, charismatic to others, but either way they get a response. When I tell somebody I found a bat in your neighborhood, it really makes them really excited and happy or worried or something. I get a reaction basically, which is great. But bats are really great opportunity because, like I said, they fly and it's a way to connect people to nature in a really personal way. In the first year, we had only 4 bat detectors, and we spread them across different locations from Santa Monica all the way to Riverside. And we did 9 locations. That very first year was very successful. All in backyards, we found 12 species of bats. 4 of these species were species of special concern. And then the second year, we had a head start. And we were able to cover more locations. And but that first year, you can see that I'll show you similar maps further down in this presentation. But the size of the circle represents the number of bat passes, bat activity in those yards, and the color represents the number of species detected in that yard. So the darker the color, the more species; the bigger the circle, the more bat activity. And that first year, we detected a species that was thought to only live in Northern California. And so we basically now know its range is totally different from what people thought. And also, we also saw that there was opportunity. We were only keeping these bat detectors in people's yards for a month because we wanted to keep moving them to different locations within the year. And so you can see here that we haven't met our maximum potential for a lot of these sites. So if it flattened out, it means that we've probably maxed out on the number of species. But you can see a lot of them are going up. And so we thought if we left these bat detectors out longer and got seasonal patterns, etc., maybe we get the full picture. And the next year, again, we had like I said, we had a head start. We did the San Fernando Valley and South LA that year. And that year, of the 12 species, we got, 8, and only one of those was a species of special concern, which is the red bat, which is also found at the Natural History Museum. But I want to say that the red bat was found in the Natural History Museum and other South Central backyards. This is a tree roosting bat that only roosts in foliage, which makes it less adaptable to the city. And it's a migratory bat that migrates from southern Canada to Central America every year. So it relies on LA as one of those stopping points along its long journey. Same with the hoary bat. And so this is where we're focused this year. We kind of took advantage of an ongoing project called the Super Project that I don't have time to talk about today. But we used certain families that were located within this South LA region put those bat detectors out, got a grant from the Disney Conservation Fund to buy more bat detectors so we can leave them in these yards the entire year for the first time. And it's paying off. So we got, even though we're in South Central LA, the most urban part of LA, we've already detected, 6 species of bats. And again, the red bat, and most recently, the yellow bat. And the yellow bat is not only a tree roosting specialist, but a palm specialist. So that whole controversy about getting rid of all our palms in LA is not as straightforward as you think. This species that's probably, uses native palms that where they exist in Southern California, is relying here in LA a lot on those non-native palms for it to be able to persist. Another species of special concern. And we're also by leaving these detectors out, we're learning that these bats are, the species accumulation requires for some neighborhoods, especially very urban neighborhoods, to be out for multiple months before you start getting some activity. So if, for instance, if I was to leave the same bat detector out for a month, I would have written off Watts, written off San Pedro as not having bats in those neighborhoods. But because I was able to leave them out for multiple months, eventually we did detect bats in those backyards. So the importance of long-term monitoring is seemingly very important for monitoring bats and getting a clear, comprehensive picture. But parks, where there's these big bodies of water, like in Harbor Regional Park, Ken Malloy is also another name for that same park, and also Magic Johnson Park in Willowbrook, and Kenneth Hahn, it didn't really matter if it was early in the winter or not. There was bats there all year round because of the prime habitat, because of the water that was there, and also all the trees that was there. So that was interesting to see. Same map, bats again, every single place we've looked. But this might have been the first year we would have said, oh, finally we met our match. But because we let these bat detectors out, we did detect bats in every single location. And we've detected 40 plus locations to date, and every single site has at least detected the Mexican free-tailed bat. Big brown bats is a surprise for us, because big browns are a very well-known bat across the country and are even considered the urban bat for some states. And here in LA, it's not the case. They're not very common at all, especially in the urban environment. And the Mexican free-tailed bat is less common in other states, but is obviously, like I said, the most common here in LA. And so here are all the sites we've covered so far. And we're engaging schools in areas where the museum hasn't really built relationships yet with certain neighborhoods. We've used schools as that way to reach those communities. So here's Jordan High School in Watts and Boys Academic Leadership Academy in Watts. And they are participating in our BAT project, and through this, hopefully building a relationship with the museum so that they're not as disconnected from the resources that we have to offer at the museum. And some challenges are actually not necessarily coordinating with these families or these schools, but actually getting out to these urban parks where there's homeless people living in there, there's a lot of vandalism, and the park managers, that's not their priority, is to help you do bat research. So I find it easier actually to work with these families and schools than to work in these public open spaces. That should be easier, right? And so here I am paddling to an island in the middle of Magic Johnson Park. But also what's been really awesome about this project is by being able to map these species and their distribution, we can do outreach in communities that we weren't able to do before and have personal connections. Instead of talking about P22 in Watts, I'm talking about bats I've detected at a school just blocks away from that location. And so that is really eye-opening for families. But then I can talk about P22, because if they look down Normandy, they can see the Hollywood sign, and I can talk about the P22 story that way. But this is our gateway. Future research goals. So it's to expand our research. Where do they hibernate? Hopefully do a crowdsourcing event. Use our community science network to ask people, are they seeing bats emerging? Because white nose syndrome just entered California, or the fungus that causes white nose syndrome just reached California. And this was an East Coast centered disease. It started upstate New York. And basically what it does, it keeps bats active when they're supposed to be resting and hibernating. And so they end up dying that way. And it's killed millions of bats throughout the country. But it's been really slow to move west until recently. It made a couple big jumps. And in Northern California, where it's colder, relatively to Southern California, that's where it's basically affected bats. So it mostly affects hibernating bats, so that's why we think it's affected bats there first. But again, white nose isn't here yet, but the fungus that causes it is here in California. But we're not ready for it here in Southern California. We don't know if bats hibernate in LA. We don't know where they're roosting in LA. We don't know if they're living in these huge roosts that make them vulnerable or not. So this is, I hope, the next step for this research is to get the community involved to also answer a question they want to answer, not just answering our questions. And the most common question that I get after if all bats have rabies is that, where are they living? Where are they roosting? And they're either asking because they're scared, they don't want them in their roof, or they're asking because they're curious and want to know how to help them. But either way, by us asking questions that both scientists and community members care about, we'll get a lot farther. And here's a really good example that I wanted to end with is, here I am at a USC football game with my family. My little brothers are with me. They're about 10 at the time. And there were moths attracted to the stadium lights, and bats were hammering those moths. And my brother knew that I was a bat nerd and would have a bat detector in my pocket and said, "Hey, Miguel, there's bats eating those moths." And I was like, "Well, really? Okay." And I had my bat detector, put it on my phone, and started blocking people's view behind me and started listening for bats. And it was really great. It was a great experience for my family and the couple people that were wondering what I was doing. But as technology gets cheaper, easier to use, more accessible, so will nature exploration, even in a random setting like a football game. And hopefully one day, it won't just be me being this really big weirdo in the stadium, but it'll be an entire stadium of people recording bats, or an entire stadium group of people that are looking in a local park or a local neighborhood that's never been searched before. And so I see this as the future, as this work gets more accessible, as we focus on species that can possibly have a better connection with the public. I think this is where the future of urban nature exploration is. And yeah, I'm happy to answer questions now. Thanks for listening. Any questions? Yeah, back there.
I'm gonna let the students.
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Go for it.
About the nature bridges that they were building, do you think only one is good enough for?
No, that's a good question. We need a lot of bridges because connectivity issues are unique to certain areas, and so just by building that bridge, you're not going to save P22, for instance. He'd need a different bridge or connection to get somewhere where he needed to go. I think he's in a pretty unique situation, though. But yes, like on the 118, they need more connectivity, not just the 101. And the 101 is getting that bridge because that's the only place along the 101 where there's open space on both sides of the freeway. Everywhere else, there's open space on one side, but not the other. And they're also finding, by looking at their GPS collar movement data, that they're all basically funneled to those little points and trying to cross there, or at least going to the edge and turning around at that particular location on both sides of the freeway. And so if we're going to invest $80 million, that's where they want to do it, because it makes the most sense. And it'll benefit a lot of species. They've done work on how lack of connectivity not only affects mountain lions, but also coyotes, bobcats, birds, salamanders. And so this bridge would help a lot of other species as well. Good question. Yeah?
In terms of bats, if there's a bunch of bat species
coexisting? How are they competing or diverging in their niches?
Yeah, good question. So some are early emergers, for instance. So like the canyon bat, which is our smallest bat in LA. It's about this big. It emerges first and during dusk, and so it gets as much food as it can, smaller insects, and then kind of goes away. And then the bigger bats come out, and which would otherwise displace it from that area. And yeah, like kind of was getting to is that they all do eat different types of insects. There's a lot of overlap, obviously, but some roost in canyons, some roost in trees, some roost in cliff faces. And so because they're occupying different habitats, or some are only using riparian habitat, for instance, that's how they're kind of staying within their niches or having their own niche. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
You might have said this, but I wasn't sure if I picked up on it. So P1, who's the father of P22, is he still alive?
No, he's not. Yeah, I didn't bring that up, but yeah, he was never found again. I forget what year was his last year, but he reached a very old age, and they kept monitoring for him. His collar failed, and they could never find his remains, which is pretty interesting. So, but because he would have been so far past the usual life expectancy of a mountain lion, they assume he's dead. Yeah.
So about the bats, you mentioned that there's 4 species of special concern.
And yeah, that we've detected.
Yeah. Are those native to California?
Yeah, so they're listed by the state of California because they're at risk of basically becoming extirpated from the state of California. Mm-hmm. So it's a listing that's California-wide, but which makes it really interesting to find them in one of the most urban parts of California, because you think all those really sensitive bats would be in our Sierra Nevadas or wherever, and those bigger mountainous areas.
And so you've got all this sort of point data that's showing us presence of species around. Have you figured out how to develop methodology to turn that into abundance of these species?
Yeah, I mean, I think I could get as far as relative abundance, because all, like the camera trap photos, these recordings are date, time, location stamped, and so I can do probably relative activity. But yeah, I haven't gotten there yet. It's a good thing to do. See if, for instance, a lot of these places have a lot of light pollution issues I didn't really get into, and that's something that some bats are affected more negatively by than others. Some actually benefit from it. So it'd be interesting to see if some are just coming out later in certain areas or earlier. So anyways, yeah.
Go ahead.
I want to go back to a sentence you said very early on in your talk. You said that as you were growing up, you were not exposed to as much information about the wildlife on Griffith Park as you deserved.
Yeah.
That was the word you used. And I tend to agree with that. I think people deserve to be educated in mathematics and reading, and that's normal, we accept that. But what about wildlife? But specifically, I'm wondering, since you've now done a lot of outreach in nature, what do you perceive as the differences in that kind of exposure for different cultural groups, different economic groups, different types of groups in LA?
What's the difference in exposure or the responses to that exposure?
To that information, to that kind of information too.
Does it resonate with some?
Does it resonate? Is it something people have access to?
Yeah.
Is it something that some groups have more access to, less access to?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very variable. So I can even speak just within the Latino community. If, for instance, they have a strong tie to a agricultural lifestyle, either here in the States or back at home where they're from, they're like, oh, I know what that animal is. I've been around animals. I'm comfortable with that. Oh, I know what bats generally like and don't like, just based on their knowledge from their experience out in nature. But there are other Latinos that are multiple generations removed from that local, personal, familial knowledge of nature. And so that's one way that there's a difference. And those communities that really don't have a tie to nature through family history or through the agricultural industry, there's a sense of fear, honestly, especially with a lot of the species that I study. They're like, oh, you study mountain lions or you study bats. They just think that's just like a big, why would you do that? Like, that's so dangerous. Why would your mom let you do that? That's a mom of parents also actually told me that once. And also the relevance is a big issue. And so, and this is across cultural groups, to be honest, is that if you're in a community that's underserved in general, and your biggest concern is, after putting food on the table and struggling to do that, is water pollution and air pollution issues, that's your environmental connection, and we're telling you to go look for lizards in your backyard, like, they don't see the relevance in that, and it's understandable. And I think there is a lot of opportunity when you can tell them that they can explore nature in the comfort of their neighborhood. They don't have to get bused to the Santa Monica Mountains or to the coast or to the desert to experience and see nature. And I think until outreach programs do more of that, I don't think that these outreach efforts will go beyond, oh, those animals are cool, I know that they exist, and they're out here somewhere in LA. It's not like, it doesn't take the step to becoming a steward in a lot of cases, because they don't have that personal connection to it, other than that one great field trip that they had. And so that's what I've gotten a lot, is that we have to take it beyond these one-off experiences that we offer these communities to opportunities where we're putting in personal work to learning about what nature would be more relevant to them and connecting them that way. And so it's a complex question, but it's good. I keep thinking about that. Does that kind of answer it? Yeah? Okay.
In the context of a species like the mountain lion, which is like super adaptable and widespread in different habitats, how do you convince the public or policymakers that kind of facilitating better human-wildlife interactions in an urban environment is necessary, when they could be saying that these animals could exist freely outside the urban environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just gotta give them science and show them where they're actually moving within urban environments and how they're responding differently, how their genetic pool is collapsing, and how they're killing each other. They have this high level of territoriality, and that the city can be a place for them. And it helps the ecosystem for them to be there. So by them being top predators in the Santa Monica Mountains and the San Gabriels, they're keeping that ecosystem healthy. So people that are really disconnected from nature but care about real estate property values and could care less about nature should still see the relevance, because if you remove those predators from those ecosystems, there's going to be an overgrazing of the habitat by their prey species. There's going to be a more homogeneous vegetation community. And our local beautiful hillsides are not going to look the same. They're not going to look as attractive. They're going to be more prone to mudslides, erosion, fire, without those predators in there, in the mix, basically. And I think that's a tie-in for people that say, oh, let them go extinct, and they can have the Sierra Nevadas instead. because, yeah, there's ways to connect it that way, I think, or in other ways. Yeah. Does that kind of answer that one? Yeah, good. You had a question?
Oh, real quick, I was wondering, are you guys aware of the closest nearby female mountain lions?
The what of female mountain lions?
Female mountain lions nearby.
The status of them?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Puma study that the Park Service is doing, they're studying males and females. It's interesting, there is definitely a difference between males and females. The males are more territorial, require more space, are generally bigger than females. And so how it usually works is if they're not too territorial, the males will tolerate 2 females within their range. And in a natural situation, they'd mate with one of them or both of them and protect that range, and that protects the female and its offspring. Another male would potentially then come in to compete for that male's range and kill that offspring to get that female back in estrus. But in our case in LA, it's just not that. It's the males are mating with females, sometimes related to them and sometimes not related to them, and then they're killing that female after they mate with her, and then they're killing their own offspring because they see them as future competitors. And they're also pushing these females into really unsuitable habitat. So you look at the female home ranges and territory versus male territories, they're in these urban edge habitats primarily, whereas the males are having all the more suitable habitat. And with the fire, with all this urban development, there's a lot less of that to go around. And so it's really pushing these females into really unsuitable situations and potentially making them vulnerable to eating more rat poison, crossing more roads. So that, in the end, will create an unsustainable population. Yeah.
To continue on the mountain lion discussion, I'm just curious, maybe this has happened already, but like say P22 attacks a hiker, like what does that mean for him? Does that mean everyone's going to be like, oh, never mind, we don't want to help these guys, they're attacking humans?
Yeah. Pretty much, honestly. I mean, they might make a special exception and put him in a sanctuary, but he would definitely be removed from the park, either lethally or just move to a sanctuary. But yeah, as far as like the general culture changing, I could see it changing. But I think what we could do is really take a step back and think how infrequent these incidents are and how unique his situation is. And he's been there almost 8 years now, and he hasn't had an incident. And so if it does happen, I mean, it's sad, and it definitely changes the narrative, but I think we could look at the positive side of his existence in the park. And potentially, that's a worry for me, honestly. I don't say this a lot to get people scared, but when he gets old and is unable to hunt, usually that's when another male will take you out, and he doesn't have another male to take him out. So what is the next step for P22 once his teeth wear out and he can't ambush prey anymore? Is he gonna just rely on, hopefully he'll just try and rely on as long as he can on rabbits and easier prey than like that, and then just die peacefully? But who knows? Yeah, it's just a unique situation. Yeah.
I'm confused about the mountain lions behavioral process. So I did more interested on like their own survival versus passing on their own genes, in sense of like them killing up their own potential offspring.
Mm-hmm. What's your question about that?
Yeah.
What is your question about? Like,
I did more interested on their.
Oh, are they more? Yes. In general, they're more, like most species, are more interested in passing on their genes. But this is just how unnatural and unsustainable the situation is because there's so little habitat and resources to go around that they feel like it's just me against the world, basically, kind of mentality. And yes, there is a little bit of passing on your genes, and that still is part of their behavior. But as we're seeing, they are killing other males, but also other females and their own offspring on a regular basis. So it seems like that behavior is winning out due to the urban pressures that are being put on them, sadly. Yes.
So kind of as a follow-on, and this probably isn't a very political question, but I mean, is there any hope for this? Because between the inbreeding and the sort of unsustainable behaviors, it seems like the population in Los Angeles just doesn't have a good future, if any future.
Yeah. I mean, I think the people that are optimistic are putting a lot of hope into that bridge, and because it's going to connect two pretty isolated populations, and they think that'll get it back on track as far as kind of crossing genes and things like that, because that 101 barrier itself is just a super limiting thing for gene flow and all that. And so yeah, I think without the bridge, they really do think they did population estimates or that they will go extinct within 50 years based on all these factors together. And even the sex ratio that's currently in the ecosystem. And so, but hopefully, yeah. And then we're also just had some incidents where a mountain lion was poached. So that's another thing to add to the mix. So it's only the second incident like that, but who knows how many are in the future. Yeah. But yeah, it's tough to say, but like I think worst case scenario though, I mean the Florida panther was saved by moving pumas from Texas, and a lot of people will suggest that that might be the way to save this population eventually, but I think even if you did that without that connectivity, it'd just be a temporary fix, if that. If not creating more competition. So I think the bridge needs to happen for that to have any success in any scenario, yeah. Yes?
Kind of going back to the bats, just are you still looking for people's backyards to host that?
Yeah, so
I'm willing to host.
our region of focus next year will be along the coast, and then and into South LA up to the 91. So if you're within that area.
In Lamar Park.
Oh, is that Lamar Park? Yeah, that might be a little bit too
It's kind of near Inglewood.
north. Yeah. I don't know. I'll have to look at the map.
Let me know. I'm willing to.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Appreciate
it's
it.
super interesting.
Appreciate that. Good questions. Yeah.
Do you think there should be like more like policy regulations to limit future development in like these currently open areas?
Yeah, and there actually are some bills that have been passed. I forget the name of it, but there's this NGO called CLAW, Citizens for Los Angeles Wildlife, and they're really pushing for more ordinances. And there's a certain council member, his name is Paul Koretz, and he's really pushing for more ordinances that really kind of limit the amount of development in places that are potential corridors for these wide-ranging species along the Santa Monica Mountains all the way to Griffith Park, which would be crucial for at least that section of the population. Yeah.
So I think we probably have to give up the room. But
Okay.
if you guys want to ask him questions one-on-one as we're sort of moving out, let's do that. And thank you again for
My pleasure, yeah. Happy to be here.